Good morning, friends. Today we will discuss the 1857 Revolt and the historiography of the 1857. All right. And the history of 1857 Revolt, like any other history, must indeed be told in detail without any sentimental attachment. Right. Now, what comes to our mind when we think of 1857 Revolt? So when I was reading some of the important literature on 1857 Revolt, the first thing which comes to my mind is India celebrated the 150th anniversary of the 1857 Revolt in 2007. Well, India celebrated the 150th anniversary of the 1857 Revolt, and what is interesting is this celebration took place in Delhi at the majestic 17th century Red Fort in May 2007. And the most important objective of this particular 150th anniversary of the 1857 Revolt was to mark the historical memory of the 1857 Revolt. And in fact, hundreds of performers enacted scenes from the 1857 Revolt to create a sense of history. And most interestingly, the then Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh told the crowd that 1857 Revolt was a shining example of our national unity. Whether the question it is a shining example of national unity or something else, we will be able to understand only through the historical records and the ways in which historians who studied 1857 Revolt. It's not something the politicians who can say something about the 1857 Revolt, and on the contrary, it is the historians who actually go into the details of the records in different repositories. And most importantly, the 1857 Revolt in India is seen in different ways. For example, there are some scholars who try to understand the 1857 Revolt as a Sepoy Mutiny. And this Sepoy Mutiny, the term Sepoy Mutiny, was a very popular term by the British, large sections of the British historians, and some of them even go to the extent to portray the 1857 as a Sepoy Revolt, and some would say the Indian Mutiny, and others would call it a Great Rebellion, and some would say it's a revolt of 1857, and some scholars identify this as Indian insurrection. And the recent historiography, and right from V.D. Savarkar and others, would claim that it's the first war of independence. Now the question is, we will be able to understand the historiography only we read a wide range of literature on 1857 Revolt. And I would try to classify the writings of 1857 broadly into three categories. The first set of writers who mostly from the British contemporary writing, starting from Henry Mead, his book A Sepoy Revolt, and you have Ernest Jones, who also has written extensively with the title The Revolt of Hindustan. And you also have British writer Justin McCarthy, History of Our Own Times. And you also have the popular British historian John Kay, who has come out with three huge volumes about 1857-58. And you also have a historian called Charles Ball. He has done a very interesting work titled The History of the Indian Mutiny. And if you read these literature, mostly from the British school of thought, you find that a large number of historians who try to understand this 1857 revolt as merely a mutiny. And second group of scholars, you find mostly missionary writers, not necessarily as professional historians, but they are writers, influenced heavily by the British policy. And most important missionary that we can think of who has written extensively on 1857 is Alexander Duff. Alexander Duff was a Scottish missionary who has done religious work and some literary work in Bengal. Some is known widely for his educational endeavor in Bengal Presidency. And he has written a very important work about 1857 with the title The Indian Rebellion, Its Causes and Results. In fact, this was published in 1858 itself. This book is also available online. You can read this important work. And here in this book, he argues that the outbreak of 1857 was not merely a military revolt. It is not a mutiny led by sepoys alone. So what else? Rather, it was the issue of a long mediated and deeply laid plan by both Hindus and Muslims. It's a very, very contentious argument. And the most important objective, according to Alexander Duff, for the 1857 revolt was the extermination and extinction of the whole Christian race. Again, this is a contentious argument as far as historians are concerned. And another important objective of 1857, according to Alexander Duff, was to overthrow the British government. And thirdly, the establishment of Muslim rule. So all these arguments of missionaries like Alexander Duff need to be studied critically and historically. And the third group of scholars who try to identify 1857 include Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, and who in fact wrote this book in 1858 itself, but he was not able to get it published. But I think in 1870s he was able to publish this important work, The Causes of Indian Revolt. And you also have in 1909 V.D. Savarkar's work, The Indian War of Independence. And later in 1857 revolt was also studied by R.C. Majumdar, the Sepoy Mutiny and the Revolt of 1857. And you have scholars like S.N. Sen, the 1857. And you also have scholars like S.B. Chowdhury, Civil Rebellion in the Indian Mutinies, and Rudraksha Mukherjee's Awadh in Revolt, and Irfan Habib's The Coming of 1857, to name a few, right? You have a long list of scholars who have worked on 1857. So I am not suggesting these are the scholars who have worked on 1857. Rather, there are a range of scholars. So the list is so long. The point is, we need to understand. I'll discuss the historiography part a little later. Now I need to focus on the reasons for the 1857 revolt. So what were the reasons for 1857? Whether the political reason which dominated, or the administrative reason, or the cultural reason, or the social, or the military reason. In fact, all reasons combined together played a very important role for the emergence of 1857 revolt. So if you look at the political and administrative reasons, the policy of conquest and consolidation that we all know. And this policy of conquest and consolidation of the East India Company therefore created suspicion and hatred among the Indian public. As historian Tarachand argues in his very important historical work, History of Freedom Movement in India, that after annexation of Indian states, resistance and revolution became a historical reality. So when he says resistance and revolution, we understand that 1857 also one of the most important reasons for the for this important historical intervention. And secondly, annexation of Indian states. Most importantly, we remember Dalhousie. Lord Dalhousie, the Governor General of India, was the one who implemented a doctrine of lapse. And according to this important policy, any state in India which doesn't have any male successor obviously would be handed over to the East India Company, or would be forcibly taken over by the East India Company. And the question is whether any adopted male child is allowed? No. So according to this doctrine of lapse, even adopted male child was not allowed for coronation. So the point is, this created popular discontent among local rulers. This is a very common factor that we need to remember. And another thing that we need to think is the British East India Company failed to implement the provision of the 1833 Act. So what is the significance of 1833 Act? Charter Act, in fact. So this act had a provision where no Indian should be disabled from holding any place or office or employment under the East India Company. So what the East India Company did, on the contrary, was deliberately and intentionally failed to implement this provision. This also therefore created a series of conflicts and confrontations with people of India, particularly among the educated Indians. And apart from these political reasons, I just mentioned a few, there are economic reasons which led to 1857 revolt. For example, the colonial policies of economic exploitation and their policy of trade, the commerce and agriculture through different land revenue systems, including the zamindari system, mahalwari system and rayatwari system. So these important colonial controversial policies therefore created discontent among different sections of the people. And as a result, we all know that India became deindustrialized, where India was forced to be a country known for its poverty and debt-ridden. And most importantly, we also need to think that the British cotton and silk goods imported into India paid only 2% of customs duty. Only 2%. But the Indian cotton goods exported to Britain paid 10% and 20% for silk, 10% for cotton goods, and even 30% for the woolen goods. So that says a lot about how there was a disparity in terms of trade and commerce. And this also therefore created discontent. So what I'm trying to suggest here is 1857 cannot be therefore contained for a particular reason or a single reason. There are multiple reasons which create a discontentment among different sections of the people. So this also was one of the reasons. And the introduction of free trade by the British in 1833, as we all know, which increased the exploitation of the economy of India. As a result of which, British economic exploitation led to a series of consequences among the peasants, even landlords to some extent, traders, industrialists, laborers, and middle class. So you find a whole range of sections of the people therefore had to undergo through difficult situations because of the colonial policies. So this also therefore led to 1857 revolt. And the third important factor that we need to remember is social and religious tensions that prevailed in India, right? So East India Company always used to see us racially, as superior, and on the contrary, India was seen as always culturally backward. So this also created tensions and confrontations between the West and the East. And they believed, therefore, that God had created the white men to civilize the Indians. So you find these kind of rhetoric in the writings of James Mill and other writings. So they also showed a kind of intolerance towards Hindu religious practices, including idolatry. And the most important aspect of this is the colonial missionaries also joined with the British. As a result, therefore, the divide and rule policy of the British was exhibited through a range of policies and programs, where this was meticulously supported by even a large section of the Christian missionaries. And similarly, there were some policy changes before 1857. For example, you have the abolition of sati in 1829, and there was a Widow Remarriage Act, introduction of Widow Remarriage Act in 1856, and you also have a Religious Disabilities Act. These are some of the important policy changes introduced by the colonial government. And these changes were seen by the Indian public as an attempt to Christianize India. Okay, this also therefore we need to see it very critically. So the war therefore of 1857 was a kind of a revolt between two different forces, right? So this is something that we also need to remember. Particularly, I would like to say something about this Religious Disabilities Act, which created a huge controversy in India in 1856 and 57. So this Religious Disabilities Act of 1856 created a special provision. What is that provision? So this provision created a special clause wherein a heir apparent, the natural successor, in this case a son, who would continue to inherit his property rights even after he changes his religion from Hinduism to any other religion, particularly Christianity. So, in other words, the property right was guaranteed to a person who is willing to change his faith. Of course, property right was, and even still, considered to be one of the most important safety mechanisms for the survival. And therefore, this simply means that a person who changes his religion cannot be denied the right to property. That's very, very significant aspect as far as this structural change is concerned. And this in many ways undermined and even violated the Hindu inheritance laws, because the Hindu inheritance laws also permitted any adoption of male heir apparent. But here the British simply questioned the legitimacy of that particular provision, and whereby this created a series of controversies. Secondly, this law also therefore promoted a kind of religious conversion indirectly, right? And even the British officials, remember, even the British officials in their casual remarks began to suggest to become officers, one has to become Christian. So this also created a series of contestations and controversies. And in fact, it gave free hand to missionaries to aggressive proselytization. That's a very, very important thing. So these Christian missionaries also played a very important role in creating conflicts, confrontations among different religious groups, particularly among Hindus. So if you read the history of the Vellore Mutiny of 1806 and the history of 1857, you find a large amount of literature which suggests that the missionaries played a very, very critical role in creating conflicts between different faiths. So now, therefore, the religious dimension also cannot be ruled out simply, that it did not play any role in 1857. Rather, religion, particularly these missionaries, played a very important role. And this, in fact, you find from missionaries themselves, the accounts of missionaries themselves, clearly suggest that they were with the British. For example, if you read a historical account of James Kennedy, he was one of the very important missionaries who made a thought-provoking statement saying that immediately after or during the 1857, several missionaries were killed in the 1857 revolt, and many Christians were scattered. What does it mean? So the missionaries also in a way played and promoted animosity between different faiths. And this also we understand from historian William Dalrymple's account when he writes his detailed work on 1857. He also points out that there is a possibility of religious dimension to the 1857, and he traces therefore the religious preludes to the 1857 revolt, and he argues that religion might not perhaps have been the only force at work. I repeat, religion might not perhaps have been the only force at work, nor perhaps the primary one, but we cannot ignore it. Right? So religion therefore played a very important role in creating 1857 revolt by creating conflicts, confrontations between different religious groups. And another important reason for the 1857 revolt that we all know perhaps from our childhood onwards, we all must have read from our school days that the most important reason for the 1857 was a military reason, and where the action of Mangal Pandey, a sepoy from Barakpur in Calcutta, near Calcutta, on 29th March 1857 led to the mutiny of sepoys in the beginning. So now it is very difficult whether Mangal Pandey's action is the only one thing which led to the 1857. Rather, Mangal Pandey's action was not a spontaneous reaction against the British officer, but it was a result of a continuous religious conflicts. This is a very, very important and a reason that we all know why Mangal Pandey was forced to react, because the sepoy suspected that the greased cartridge that was used in the newly introduced in-field rifles was filled with the fat of cow and pig. So this was suspected therefore by the sepoys, and therefore they had to react. Both Hindus and Muslims therefore had to react. So the grease in which the cartridge was packed affected the religious sensibilities of Hindus as well as Muslim soldiers, as they had to bite and peel the cartridge before they were supposed to use. And we all know therefore this perhaps was the most important reasons, one of the most important reasons for this 1857 revolt, and Mangal Pandey reacted to it, and he had to attack some British officers, and as a result of which he had to undergo a series of consequences, which means he was arrested, punished, and executed. So now the question is, what happened in Barakpur therefore led to different parts of India. For example, it led to Lucknow, Bareilly, Kanpur, Jhansi, in central India, Bundelkhand, and these places therefore became centers of the 1857 revolt. And in a way, the whole North India was in this particular scenario. So South was comparatively peaceful for a variety of reasons. And even Punjab and Hyderabad also was relatively peaceful. And the question that we need to remember is, who are the leaders who are leading this 1857 revolt? Whether they were able to be successful in their endeavors or they had to face a severe setback in the 1857 revolt. Of course, there were prominent leaders who played a significant role in the 1857 revolt. You have Rani of Jhansi in UP, who sacrificed her life. You also have Nana Sahib, the adopted son of Peshwa Bajirao II, who led mutiny at Kanpur. And you have leaders like Kanwar Singh of Awadh, who also played a very important role. And you also have Begum Hazrat Mahal, who also played a very, very important role. And Bahadur Shah Zafar II, that we all know, he was in a way the prime minister for the entire country during 1857. He was made to be a leader or prime minister during 1857. And Nana Sahib, as I told you, therefore you have Khan Bahadur Khan and a range of leaders at the local level. But the question is, they were not able to be successful in their attempts by defeating the British forces. And the question is, there are many reasons for the failure of the 1857 revolt. So, the revolt of 1857, even today we continue to discuss, was studied by different scholars, and the revolt was not able to be successful due to a number of reasons, because it was in a way not an all India phenomenon, because you find mostly in the northern parts of India, and the sepoys in North India were the one who played very actively in this 1857 revolt, and therefore the revolt took largely in North India and did not make any impact in southern part of India. And secondly, the revolt failed to get the attention of all sections of the people, including zamindars, all local rulers. And in fact, if you read John Kay's work, he would say that almost all the local rulers were supporting the British wholeheartedly. And these sections, therefore, local rulers and zamindars, therefore, refused to join the revolt against the British, because they wanted to keep their power and position with them. And another important reason for the failure of 1857 was lack of coordinated planning amongst the leaders. Of course, you have a range of leaders in different parts of India, but if you ask a question, is there any centralized leadership? It's really $1 million question. So there was, in fact, the absence of centralized leadership who can lead 1857 revolt. And because we all also need to know that there was also a kind of lack of a spirit of nationalism. Even though this 1857 revolt sowed the seeds of nationalism, in the post 1857, you hardly find any credible evidence where you find that people revolted against the British with, patriotism and nationalism. You find, therefore, there was a kind of lack of spirit of nationalism. This also argued by some of the scholars that led to the decline of 1857. And similarly, you also find that all kinds of means of communications and transports were meticulously used by the British, be it railway or be it other modes of transport and communications. So they were able to use these provisions meticulously to fight back the revolutionary sepoys. So this also therefore played a very, very negative role. On the one side, Indians were not able to make use of the provisions effectively. On the other side, the British were able to make use of the provision which they created for themselves. So this also was one of the most important reasons for the failure of 1857 revolt. And the consequences are really historic. The 1857 revolt therefore created a series of consequences. For example, the Queen Elizabeth made her proclamation in November 1858, and this provision made a series of contentious statements. One such statement was that the doctrine of lapse was discontinued, because they felt that the doctrine of lapse was of no use after 1857, because you have a direct rule by the British. No more there was rule by the East India Company itself, and therefore it announced the policy of territorial extension would be stopped, but this is conditional. It said that if the Indian rulers cooperate with the British, then the British would in turn make sure that the Indian rulers get a kind of safety and some rights and honor. But again, we need to remember this is conditional. So this is also one of the most important consequences. So first, doctrine of lapse was discontinued, and it was a kind of guarantee, made by the British for the Indian rulers. But one thing is very clear, that the policy of divide and rule was actively pursued by the British to keep the Hindus and Muslims divided. Right? And a number of soldiers was increased after 1857, and you have different religious communities, especially the Hindus and Muslims started blaming each other. So this is also a meticulous method of dividing the people by the British. So the revolt of 1857 therefore in a way widened the gap between different religious communities, at least for some time, where they started blaming each other for the defeat of the 1857, for the failure of the 1857. And another important consequence of the 1857 was, it was the first anti-colonial at the large scale. The 1857 rebellion was the first anti-colonial mass movement in India against the imperial policies of the British. And secondly, it was also the first armed movement faced by the British in India. So the British never thought that they would be facing such a huge resistance from the Indian side. So therefore, the point which I'm trying to emphasize is, despite the fact there were leaders, despite the fact there were mechanisms for the soldiers to fight the British, and they were not able to be successful in their endeavor, rather it led to a series of negative implication on the part of the Indian side. And the question is, of course, the British had to learn a lesson from the 1857 revolt. What was the lesson learned by the British? So if you read Thomas Metcalfe's work, an important article, The Impact of the British on British Attitudes to India, the impact of the mutiny on British attitudes to India, he makes a very interesting aspect where he thinks that the British had to learn the most important lesson from the 1857 revolt. So what was the lesson? Thomas Metcalfe makes this argument. He says the British had come to a logical conclusion that Indians could never be trusted nor reformed. So the only option left for the British was to rule the Indians. We know the history after 1857, 1858, the direct rule. So for the British, again Thomas Metcalfe argues, this was the great lesson of the revolt. What was the great lesson of the revolt? Indians could never be trusted nor reformed, and the only option left for the British therefore was the Indians must be ruled. And the implications of the mutiny on British attitudes to India therefore include three important things. One is the British started following a policy of pessimism, and second, policy of conservatism, and third, policy of authoritarianism. This does not mean that they had no idea of this pessimism, conservatism and authoritarianism in the pre-1857, but this 1857 revolt therefore intensifies, right? The 1857 revolt intensifies these ideas, the pessimism, conservatism and authoritarianism. So now the question is, as I told you, these are some of the reasons which led to 1857 revolt. So as I told you, I am not giving you the entire picture as in the reasons, consequences and the results in a conventional way. I'm just giving some explore it textbooks. So now it's very important that we understand the reasons for 1857, and we also understand who were the leaders who played a very important role in the 1857, at least some of the leaders, and we also understand the implications and the reasons for the failure of the 1857 revolt. Now we need to remember how historians try to interpret the 1857 revolt. Of historical interpretation. So how the historians try to understand 1857 revolt? As I told you, some would say it's a Sepoy Mutiny, Indian Mutiny, Great Rebellion, Revolt of 1857, Indian Insurrection and First War of Independence. So therefore I would like to see a kind of transition that took place in the historical writings. This transition I would understand from Sepoy Mutiny to War of Independence. Okay, it's my understanding. Okay, the historical writing therefore began with Sepoy Mutiny, and now what we see today, this mutiny therefore is seen as a war of independence. So I will be discussing what kind of transition took place from Sepoy Mutiny to Indian War of Independence. So now the question comes, what is mutiny and what is rebellion? As it is defined, a mutiny is when members of a country challenge a military unit and disobey the orders of their superiors or commanding officers. This is how a mutiny, the term mutiny is defined. Whereas a rebellion is defined in such a way that when citizens of a country challenge the authority of their leaders and government. Okay, you understand the difference. Sepoy therefore is in a microscopic resistance, whereas rebellion is interpreted as a macroscopic level. Now, it's important, as historian Irfan Habib argues in his important article, The Coming of 1857, the revolt of 1857 began as a mutiny, right? If you read his article, it's available online. He says the revolt of 1857 began as a mutiny of the Bengal army, right? And who throughout the course of the revolt, the sepoys of the Bengal army throughout the course of the revolt proved themselves to be the most steadfast in its cause. So I think this is a very important beginning of my discussion. How the 1857 revolt, therefore, began merely as a mutiny. Now the question is, as a historian, as a student of history, in fact, we understand when politics changes, everything changes. So this 1857 revolt created a series of discussions, debates, deliberations in London. For example, when this 1857 revolt was going on, the Prime Minister of Britain was Lord Palmerston. Lord Palmerston was the British Prime Minister when the 1857 took place. He was a statesman and he served as a Prime Minister twice, and he played a very important role in shaping the British policy during the period 1830s to 1865. And it was when he was the Prime Minister and he, in fact, the Britain was at the height of imperial power. While there were heated debates and discussions in the House of Commons in London on the nature of 1857 revolt, Palmerston, in fact he was the Prime Minister, as I told you, of Britain, tried to moderate the scope and significance of the event. Remember, it was not historians who have started discussing, it was the Prime Minister himself trying to moderate what is the nature of the 1857. Whether it was a revolution, whether it was a mutiny, or whether it was a war of independence. And finally he comes to a logical conclusion, saying that it was a military mutiny. It was a mutiny, right? So this is the first ever statement made by the British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, in 1857 itself. But on the contrary, of course, every government has a ruling as well as opposition party. So the opposition party member was making something else. He was talking something else in contradiction to what was said by Palmerston. When the revolt of 1857 was still on, there were wars of, war of words between the ruling and the opposition leaders in the House of Commons. While speaking at the House of Commons in July 1857, Benjamin Disraeli made a series of speeches. Who is Benjamin Disraeli? He was a British politician of the Conservative Party, and he was also the British Prime Minister twice, and he played an important role in strengthening the Conservative Party. And he was the one who labeled the 1857 revolt as a national revolt. Okay, so here we are. On the one side, the ruling Prime Minister was making something saying that the 1857 revolt was merely a mutiny. On the other side, you have the statement made by Benjamin Disraeli saying that this was a national revolt. So what was the reason which made him to think so? Because now you have two conflicting views, even in London. It's not view between India and London. It's views in the House of Commons itself. So according to Benjamin Disraeli, there were three important reasons which made him to suggest that it was a national revolt. For example, forceful destruction of native authority in India by the British through policy of annexation. Particularly, he's talking about Dalhousie's doctrine of lapse, and the disturbance of settlement of property through various land revenue settlements, and tampering with the religions of the people. So he himself, therefore, was critical of the British policies and how, therefore, it created discontent among the people of India. So now, what the politicians, therefore, made were taken up by historians. It's not the historians who had come out with Sepoy Mutiny first and the National Revolution in the first place. Rather, the politicians, therefore, now set the ground ready for the discussion. Even now, we understand when any politician makes a historical statement, the next immediate day we read articles by historians in response or in reaction to the politician's statement. So this was the case in 1857 itself. And the speeches, therefore, made in the House of Commons were taken up by colonial writers, administrative historians, to suggest that 1857 revolt was merely a Sepoy mutiny. And the British historians, most importantly John Lawrence, John Seeley, continued to portray this 1857 revolt as merely a mutiny. Now the question is, the term mutiny was frequently used by the imperialist officials and writers, not professional historians. Those who had an obsession for the term mutiny, therefore, argued that 1857 revolt became a historical reality largely due to the discontent policy adopted against the sepoys, who were unhappy with the introduction of the new Enfield rifle, which I have discussed. According to these writers, the new Enfield rifle required the bullet to be bitten before loading. And these were rumors that the grease used on the bullets was either from the fat of cattle or pigs, which had a series of implications. The fact of the matter, therefore, is that while the Hindus considered cows sacred, the Muslims perceived pigs to be polluting. And these cultural sensibilities, therefore, created discontentment among the sepoys. And therefore, these writers were mostly sponsored officially by Governor Generals, claimed that this was merely a sepoy mutiny. And if you read the history of John William Kay and Colonel Malleson, who studied 1857 revolt under the direction of Lord Canning. Always remember, it was not their passion for history. Rather, it was the colonial sponsor, the government sponsor made John William Kay and Colonel Malleson to come out with their work. So both of them, John Kay and Malleson, published their work in 1888 with the title Indian Mutiny of 1857. See, it was published in 3 volumes, and remember, when Lord Canning was the Governor General, he was the one who asked them to write these books. But unfortunately, he was not able to see those volumes because he died in 1862. And even when the volumes were published in 1888, John Kay admitted that he wanted to dedicate these volumes to Lord Canning. Informally, he said, I quote, which I read it from his book, John Kay said, I quote, I should have dedicated these volumes to Lord Canning. Had he lived, I now inscribe them reverentially to his memory. I repeat, I should have dedicated these volumes to Lord Canning. Had he lived, I now inscribe them reverentially to his memory. So that speaks volume about how these so-called writings, therefore, were sponsored by the colonial government itself to suggest that the 1857 revolt was merely mutiny. And similarly, there were scholars like John Lawrence, as I told you, Charles Trevelyan, Charles Ball, Henry Mead, all these scholars, quote unquote, writers, therefore continue to portray the 1857 revolt as a mutiny. And for example, John Lawrence in October 1857 stated that it was a Sepoy mutiny largely due to the fact that the local rulers did not fight the British. It's a very, very important point to be noted. John Lawrence, he made a remark saying that the Sepoy mutiny can be justified, the term Sepoy can be justified largely due to the fact that the local rulers did not fight the British at the national level unitedly. For example, he said that had the six joined against the British, nothing, humanly speaking, could have saved us. Which means the Punjab Sepoys did not actively participate, and therefore he was under the impression that had the six joined against the British, nothing, humanly speaking, could have saved us. So therefore he has a point how it was not a national revolt, how it was not a war of independence. Rather, he argues that it was merely a Sepoy mutiny. And another important scholar that we need to remember, historian Charles Ball, in his book The History of Sepoy Mutiny, attempts to give a balanced account. On the one hand, he argues that none of the native princes had taken part in this outbreak. In fact, he maintains that the entire native princes had sided with the British government. The entire British, therefore, had the support of the native princes. And he claims that some of the native rulers rendered the most valuable assistance to the British. In fact, as I discussed earlier, this also could be one of the reasons for the failure of the 1857 revolt. So this also an account comes from the British writer. But on the other side, we also need to remember Charles Ball argues that the mutiny became the rebellion of a whole people. It's not merely mutiny, and it also therefore turned out to be a rebellion on the other side. How? Because it became the rebellion of the people largely due to the imaginary wrongs of the British, the hatred and fanaticism against the British. So therefore he finds that a large number of the people also participated in the 1857 revolt. Not necessarily the Sepoy. Have a range of sections of the people who revolted against the British. So therefore it's very important that we need to remember how British scholars themselves got divided ideologically, saying that it is both a Sepoy mutiny as well as a national revolt. For example, John Seeley, in his work, he says the revolt was a wholly unpatriotic and selfish sepoys. So he also says, therefore, there was no spirit of patriotism in 1857. There was no passion for nationalism. So the whole debate, therefore, made by John Seeley, it centers around that there was unpatriotism, there was selfish sepoys, and the relationship, therefore, among the sepoys were not cordial, and therefore he maintains that the rebellion of the Indian sepoys, therefore, did not succeed for a variety of reasons. And similarly, you find a large number of accounts by T.R. Holmes, a British writer. He also identifies it at the 1857 revolt as merely a mutiny. And you also have, Lieutenant General James Outram. He also has done very important research. He also says that it was merely a sepoy war, it has nothing to do with the national sentiments of the people, because only the North Indian, the section of North India participated in the revolt. And therefore, we need to see that those historians, writers, colonial officials who wanted to study the 1857, most of them portray the 1857 merely as a sepoy mutiny. As historian Biswamoy Pati argues in the 1857 rebellion, in his important book, The 1857 Rebellion, it was the direct result of the British policy of conquest and expansion, colonial consolidation. And he also argues in this important work, Historians and Historiography, Situating 1857, he makes a very important argument that the colonial officials and the British writers, I repeat, the colonial officials and the British writers continue to use the term sepoy mutiny. So the mutiny school of thought therefore believed that it was a direct outcome of the sepoy anger due to the greased cartridges. Similarly, contemporary newspapers supported the British efforts and opposed the soldiers' resistance. So now the question is, it is in these historical narratives we need to situate how Indians studied the 1857 revolt. So the ways in which the British presented their account are completely different from how Indians perceived 1857 revolt. For example, if you read Syed Ahmad Khan, in fact, he was perhaps the first Indian who wrote the 1857 issue in 1858 itself. But he was not able to publish it. So he was able to publish the work only in 1873. So the fact of the matter is, Syed Ahmad Khan perhaps was the first one to write 1858, but it was published obviously in 1873 for a variety of reasons. And he uses the term rebellion to refer to the 1857 revolt. He argued that the 1857 revolt did not originate from a single cause, but there were multiple complex reasons. For example, he has a series of issues. For example, interference of the government with the religious customs of Indians, and the annexation policy adopted by the British government, the establishment of missionary schools, and the interference of Christian missionaries, and the preaching of gospel by the missionaries, and the gradual change in the existing system of education, the promulgations of objectionable laws, which I have pointed out, and the revenue settlements introduced by the British government, and the insubordinate state of Indian forces are some of the reasons for the 1857 revolt as far as Syed Ahmad Khan is concerned. Now the question is, another important study that we need to remember in continuation of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, you have V.D. Savarkar. I have a detailed discussion. So V.D. Savarkar was the one who wrote his book Indian War of Independence in 1909, where he comes out with a range of ideas and why he calls it a war of independence, why it was not Sepoy Mutiny, And in fact, he has quoted a series of statements made by some of the liberal historians of the British. We will discuss it a little later. And in 1957, for example, the 100th anniversary of 1857 revolt was happening in India, and in 1955 itself, the then education minister Abul Kalam Azad was the education minister in 1950s. 1955, he made a requisition to historian S.N. Sen. He requested S.N. Sen, historian, to write a volume about 1857 revolt. Consequently, S.N. Sen was able to publish his book on 1857 in 1957 to commemorate 100th anniversary of the 1857 revolt. And similarly, you have two important works which were published in 1957. So 1957 is also important because 100th anniversary of the 1857 revolt took place. And similarly, R.C. Majumdar also has come out with his important work on 1857. And the third important work, Sashi Bhushan Chowdhury, S.B. Chowdhury, and he also had written an important work, Civil Rebellion in the Indian Mutinies, 1857-58. So the point which is intriguing is how these scholars, Indian scholars, therefore try to differentiate themselves from the British historical writing. So on the one side, the British historical writings completely tried to dismiss that it was no longer all India national revolt, rather it was Sepoy Mutiny. On the contrary, Indian scholars therefore tried to understand 1857 revolt in a different perspective. So for example, as I told you, there were some scholars who tried to identify the 1857 revolt both as a mutiny as well as a revolt. If you read R.C. Majumdar's work, the character of outbreak of 1857, you get something very, very fascinating. He argues that it was both a mutiny as well as a revolt. How? He argues that the people revolted against the British forces powerfully in places like Awadh region, which expressed national character. Nevertheless, he suspected that there was unity among Hindus and Muslims. He suspected there was no unity among Hindus and Muslims. For example, there were communal riots in the United Provinces during this time. The Muslims shouted the revival of Muslim kingdom. That's what the argument is made by R.C. Majumdar. And similarly, in another important work, R.C. Majumdar's work, Sepoy Mutiny and the Revolt of 1857, R.C. Majumdar maintains that there was no coordination between different groups of rebels and their leaders. Each group or individual leader fought for their own vested interest, who had no common cause. For example, R.C. Majumdar quotes few instances. Most importantly, Bahadur Shah and Nana Zagib used their power as independent rulers. There was no unity, there was no uniformity, there was no coordination, therefore, between these two individuals, and they were treated as enemies by sepoys themselves. And that is the reason why R.C. Majumdar concludes that there are reasons to suggest that it was both mutiny and a revolt. And similarly, you also have a school of thought popularly known as Marxist interpretations, and Karl Marx, in fact, argued that the anger of the people of the 1857 revolt was the direct result of the British exploitation. So he was trying to look at from a class perspective. Similarly, influenced heavily by the ideology of Karl Marx and Engels, the communist thinkers in India like M.N. Roy, R.P. Duff, and other Marxist scholars therefore applauded the unity showed by the Hindus and Muslims in opposing the British colonialism. And the point is, these Marxist scholars therefore try to argue that the revolution was a combined struggle of soldiers and peasants against the feudal bondage of the British. And it was also therefore a product of dissatisfaction of the people against the foreign government. So you have therefore on the one side a British school of thought always arguing that it was merely a Sepoy mutiny, and secondly you have a range of scholars particularly from the Indian side who keep arguing that it was both a Sepoy mutiny and revolt and a war of independence. And here these Marxist scholars therefore try to argue that it was a peasant struggle against the feudal bondage of the British. So now the question is, what is the recent historiography? What is the recent historiography of the 1857 revolt? Why we need to update the discussion and debates? For example, the contemporary newspapers in England were condemnatory towards 1857 revolt. And here you have a historian, Justice McCarthy. As I told you, he was also one of the most important liberal historians who tried to contribute something substantial to the understanding of the 1857 revolt, and he identifies this as a national revolt. For example, I quote some of the important remarks made by Justin McCarthy in his book, A History of Our Own Times. He makes a following statement. I quote, quotation begins, "The fact was that throughout the greater part of the northern and northwestern provinces of the Indian peninsula, there was a rebellion of the native races against the English power. It was not alone the Sepoy who rose in revolt. It was not by any means merely military mutiny. It was a combination of military grievance, national hatred, and religious fanaticism against the English occupation in India. The native princes and native soldiers were in it. The Mohammedan and the Hindus forgot their old religious antipathies to join against the Christians. Hatred and panic were simultaneous of the great rebellion. If that spark had not lighted it, some other would have done the work. The Meerut sepoys found in a moment a leader, a flag, and a cause, and the mutiny was transformed into a revolutionary war. When they reached the Jamna river, glittering in the morning light, they had all unconsciously seized one of the great critical moments of history and converted a military mutiny into a national and religious war." Unquote. This is the turning point of the discussion. So how Justin McCarthy, in his writing, therefore, instilled a spirit of historical inquisitiveness among historians, among writers of India. And in fact, if you read V.D. Savarkar's work, you find at least a considerable amount of reproduction of the statements made by Justin McCarthy. For example, Savarkar has quoted writings and observations made by Western scholars, nationalists and liberal historians to suggest that 1857 revolt was a national and war of independence. Remember, V.D. Savarkar was not the one who had come out with this idea of 1857 as a national war of independence, because this view was already there among some of the liberal historians. So this view therefore was taken up and further investigated, further studied, further analyzed and interpreted, and this interpretation therefore became a very, very dominating discourse, a narrative in the Indian historical writings. And it's very important. Again, V.D. Savarkar was not the first one to suggest that 1857 was a national revolt. For example, V.D. Savarkar himself makes that it was Azimullah Khan. Azimullah Khan. If you read V.D. Savarkar's work, it's available online. And he himself made this statement. He said, Azimullah Khan was one of the earliest to convince the idea of the war of independence. Let me repeat. It was Azimullah Khan was one of the earliest to conceive the idea of war of independence. Of the important characters of the Revolutionary War of 1857, the name of Azimullah Khan is one of the most memorable. This is not my words. This is the statement made by V.D. Savarkar himself. And he also goes on to saying that among the keen intellectuals and grand minds that first conceived the idea of war of independence, Azimullah Khan must be given a prominent place. Azimullah Khan must be given a prominent place. And V.D. Savarkar also says that among the many plans by which the various phases of revolution were developed, the plans of Azimullah Khan deserve special notice. Now you are the best judge to decide who made the statement about whom and who therefore needs to be understood, studied in a professional way. And who is this Azimullah Khan? Azimullah Khan was initially appointed secretary and later made to be prime minister to Nana Sahib. Azimullah Khan also was involved in the Indian Mutiny in 1857, primarily ideologically. Remember, he did not participate in the war physically in fighting against the British. Rather, he was fighting the battle ideologically, influencing important nobles such as Nana Sahib, who involved in a long drawn out appeal to the British East India Company to restore to him the 80,000 pounds of annual pension that his father, exiled to the kingdom of Awadh, had been granted. So he chose Azimullah Khan to go to England in 1853 to plead his case. So the point is, we need to remember, in his own words, in the words of V.D. Savarkar, it was Azimullah Khan, therefore, was one of the earliest to conceive the idea of war of independence. And something interesting, why Savarkar, therefore, was influenced by the writings of the liberal Western historical interpretations. Savarkar also quoted extensively, as I told you, of the writings of the British historian James Innes' book, The Sepoy Revolt, which was published in 1897. The struggle of the people of Awadh region, therefore, must be characterized as War of Independence. So this, therefore, could possibly be one of the reasons why V.D. Savarkar was influenced by some of the writings of the Western scholars. Now, let me discuss little detail of V.D. Savarkar's interpretation. So, V.D. Savarkar was possibly first Indian to write the 1857 revolt from a nationalist perspective. And interestingly, if you read the first few pages of V.D. Savarkar's work, you find there's no mention of V.D. Savarkar as the author. Rather, you find an Indian nationalist. So he himself claims that author should be mentioned as an Indian nationalist. So what I'm trying to say here is the most important aspect in this particular work should be seen from a nationalist perspective. So he published his work, as we all know, in 1909, and it was the first war of independence, according to him, against the British by Hindus and Muslims. And he also, in fact, stated that it was a great revolt of the people. It was a war against the atrocities by the British. It was a war of independence fought jointly by Hindus, Muslims like Rani of Jhansi, Nana Sahib, Kunwar Singh, Khan Bahadur Khan, and others. So V.D. Savarkar therefore has a long list of reasons to justify his claim why it was a war of independence. For example, he stated that it was not Sepoy Mutiny, but it was a war of independence. How and why? It was a revolt against the political slavery, according to V.D. Savarkar. This revolt had nothing to do with the selfishness of personal gain. The ideas such as sacred flame of liberty, these are all words of V.D. Savarkar, okay? So the glorious ideal of Swaraj and the Swadharma, one's own duty, were burning there. And V.D. Savarkar also says that the sepoys had given their blood for the sacred principles of liberty. The whole civil population all over the country, from villages and towns, played a significant role in this war of independence. Again, this is a statement made by V.D. Savarkar. And in fact, he also goes on to saying that sepoys, shopkeepers, Brahmins, Maulvis, Rajas, Zamindars, Talukdars, villagers and agriculturists all became united against the British. So, and this also was one of the reasons why he identifies 1857 revolt as the first war of independence. And similarly, Savarkar also stated that Bahadur Shah Zafar II, okay, this is not the Hindutva V.D. Savarkar we are talking about. We are talking about the first war of independence, Savarkar, right? And Savarkar also stated Bahadur Shah Zafar II, the last Mughal ruler of the Mughal Empire, was elevated by the free voice of the people. So this is the term which he uses, free voice of the people, both Hindus and Muslims, civil and military, to be either emperor, to be their emperor and head of war of independence. Remember, if I may ask you the question, who was the head of this war of independence? It was, according to Savarkar, Bahadur Shah Zafar II. Bahadur Shah Zafar II, according to Savarkar, was the head of the War of Independence. Okay, this is how the War of Independence Savarkar is trying to make. And similarly, Savarkar also indicates that the United Provinces, Awadh, Rohilkhand, Bihar, Bengal, Bundelkhand, Central India were the field of Kurukshetra War of Independence of 1857. Okay, he uses the term Kurukshetra of the War of Independence. So he therefore identifies that there were large sections of the people cutting across religious denominations, cutting across class differentiations. All of them participated and revolted against the British, which therefore could possibly be one of the reasons why we calls this revolt as a war of independence. And secondly, two more things I would like to emphasize here. Savarkar also stated that both Hindus and Muslims, remember, this is 1857 Savarkar, okay? Both Hindus and Muslims, according to Savarkar, who fed on the same mother's milk, rose together to fight the English rule. Not only the able-bodied sepoys, but also all the military pensioners enrolled themselves as national volunteers. I need to repeat this once again. I think I am so overwhelmed by the fact that Savarkar himself made this statement. For some, it may be unbelievable, but I have to make it. So Savarkar stated that both Hindus and Muslims who fed on the same mother's milk rose together to fight the English rule. Not only the able-bodied sepoys, but also old military pensioners enrolled themselves as national volunteers. So this is very, very important aspect why he therefore uses continuously the term War of Independence. And V.D. Savarkar also therefore maintains that the revolt had thoroughly permeated all classes of the population, including shopkeepers, Marwaris, Banyas, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and other sections of the society. And they also took such an important part of this popular agitation. This is very, very important aspect that we need to remember. And what is most interesting, therefore, in this 1857 revolt? What do you think? Whether it is a sepoy mutiny, or you think it's a sepoy revolt, or it's a national revolution, or it's a war of independence? So now you are the best judge to make a convincing conclusion for yourself. I have tried to point out some of the important aspects. I have tried to suggest some of the important arguments. I also tried to emphasize the transition between the sepoy mutiny to the War of Independence. Now you please go through the text that I have cited. I'm sure you'll be able to explore many more interesting things about 1857 revolt. This is not the end of the story. As a student of history, I always admire E.H. Carr's statement. History is therefore a continuous process of interaction between past and present. And history is also an unending dialogue between historians and their facts. So what you have studied so far, what you have listened so far, is not the end of the story. As historians, therefore, you have to go back to the sources, you have to transcend the boundaries, and you have to try to understand through your own perspective. I think that will be really a wonderful exercise of you budding historians. Thank you for taking time, and I'm sure you will go through the texts which I have referred to. I'm sure you'll be able to enjoy the revolt, not necessarily through a sentimental approach, but what we have in the historical documents. Right? Thank you once again for taking your valuable time to listen to this lecture. Thank you.